Hello everyone, my name is Dag Lyster. I am the CEO of FrontCore. For those of you who don't know FrontCore, we develop cloud-based training management software delivered as a SaaS. And we've had some really interesting conversations with training providers over the past few weeks regarding the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the training industry. So we decided to make a series of 3 videos together with Espen Andersen, professor of BI, to talk about some of the interesting topics surrounding this. In the first video, we'll talk about the COVID-19's impact on the training market, short-term and long-term. And we'll discuss also the infection control measures and how it potentially leads to digital transformation as well as disruption in the industry. In the second video, we'll talk about the benefits of doing training in the online format, both from the perspective of the training providers, but also from the participants. And in the third video, we'll talk about some really practical steps. What do you need to do to convert your training from classrooms to the online format? And I'm really glad to welcome Espen Andersen here with me today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Espen is an associate professor of strategy at BI, Norwegian Business School. He leads the Center for Digitalization at BI, and he is also an adjunct associate professor at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Oslo. He holds a doctorate of business administration at Harvard Business School, and he is also research consulted and spoken on technologies issues for a wide range of corporations across the United States, Europe, and Australia, and currently is also serving on 2 boards of technology companies. I would also venture to say that Espen Andersen is an authority in online teaching and capacity of his work. Only a few weeks ago, Espen, we were leading our normal busy lives. We were going to work, we were hanging out with friends, we were planning our holidays. Now we can't do that anymore. Times have changed. And not only have times changed, but there's a lot of uncertainties going on, and both with health, but also with, the economy. And this is why we're having this discussion today about the potential effect of COVID-19 and the pandemic on the training industry specifically today. Before we do that, let me just summarize, to put this in perspective, some of the chain of events that led us up to this discussion today. The 31st of December, the WHO office in Wuhan, in Hubei, China, received information about several cases of pneumonia of unknown etiology. And roughly about mid-January, 13th of January, Thailand, as the first of many subsequent countries, started reporting cases. 11th of March, the WHO declares the global COVID-19 outbreak as a pandemic. And what ensued is, globally closed borders, travel restrictions, containment measures with social distancing, restricting movement, working remote, businesses closing down by decree, and also quarantines. And what we've seen is today 1.9 million cases in 210 countries and territories, 118,000 deaths. We've seen massive unemployment. In Norway now, we have the highest unemployment rates since the World War II, 412,000 registered. ILO expect cutbacks equivalent to 200 million full-time workers in the next 3 months. And they assess full or partial lockdown affects about 81% of the global workforce, or 2.7 billion workers. And so with with medical treatment and vaccines potentially 18 to 24 months away, how will this affect, the economy in general and the training market specifically?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, the sort of obvious answer is that a lot that was not online will have to go online, and a lot of people who deliver training and courses will suffer quite badly. Not just for the delivery of courses, but also things like recruitment. It's also pretty clear to me that it will be a very uneven distribution. Some will experience a lot of demand, and you will also see changes in the competition within industries, because if you're ready to go online, then and you've been waiting to do so, and perhaps you already do something online, you will probably take big market shares on your competition, who are less ready to go online, or perhaps have training or teaching methodologies that are not so easy to take online.
In countries now affected by COVID-19, and this is different, we see, depending on the strategy selected by the government, but in most countries now affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, virtually all classroom-based training has been either cancelled or suspended. And it looks like there'll be no room for that format in the foreseeable future. What specifically are we now seeing taking place in the education and training industry to adapt to this short-term situation?
Well, depends on whether it's short-term or not. The scramble, and I can only speak on a personal level for sort of how this effect is, but I teach at a big business school. I teach at a university. I do quite a bit of online training and also give talks and so on and so forth. And everything that involves physical meeting has simply disappeared. Some of that is moving online, and some will be reduced, and there will also be new opportunities for doing things. You see a lot of geographical restrictions disappearing. For instance, I live in Norway. I used to be a consultant in the United States. Distance was a problem. Well, now everybody is online, so okay, so perhaps I can find a new market somewhere outside Norway, because it doesn't really matter anyway. But so you'll see a lot of people struggling to get online, struggling to figure out what this means, and for a lot of the traditional training providers, you see really bad economic consequences, because it's going online is complicated, and it involves not just changing how you teach and how you deliver your material. It's a change to your business model and to the market.
So, I was looking at some data on the global training market, and according to trainingindustry.com, the global corporate training market is estimated to be $370 billion US.
Yeah.
What's your overall take on how the pandemic we're now observing and how it's actually changing the training market?
Well, it will obviously shrink, and there are a couple of reasons for that. Training is a discretionary expense, at least in the short run. So it's something you cut back on, like travel. And so that's one part of it. People will, companies will have less money and they have to save. So in the short run, you will see cuts. That's somewhat mitigated by the fact that a lot of people will lose their job, or have other forms of getting compensation from outside their regular job. And what we see in some parts of the training market is that it's almost counter-cyclical. so that, you know, if a lot of people lose their job because there's an economic downturn, as part of their package when they leave, they often get training. So some providers of training will see an uptick. And you'll also see that, you know, students who were planning to go out and work after a bachelor degree, maybe they will decide to stay on in university and do a master's instead. So the market, I think, will overall it will shrink, and it will shrink quite substantially. But there will be pockets where you will see growth or stability.
Will due to the fact that we now have a very, very unprecedented situation where both the demand and the supply side are collapsing, do you think maybe this will lead to education not being counter-cyclical anymore?
Uh, well, what is they say? You know, if you think knowledge is expensive, try stupidity. But and you know, people will need education. I mean, short term, you'll need to teach online, right? You'll need to learn how to do that. We'll need to be better at video conferencing. We will definitely need to learn how to collaborate over electronic means to a much larger extent than we had before. I mean, for pockets of the economy, working online, doing video conferencing is old hat. You've done it for a long time. But now everybody has to do it, and everybody has to learn not just to do it poorly, which is what you do the first couple of weeks, but to
Right.
do it well, which is, you know, takes quite a bit of training, takes more thought.
Is there opportunities out there now for company who is now adapting and are being inventive to actually get a competitive edge if they treat training differently than what we've seen in the past years during crisis?
Well, yes, I think there's lots of opportunity. It comes in kind of two packages. I mean, I can compare it to something very simple. My wife works in a yarn store that sells yarn for knitting. That is not a high margin business at all. Okay, most people who run these stores run them as a hobby, or, you know, as something they like to do. The yarn store she works for has a small website where they sell yarn, and that has turned out to be extremely important. The business is counter-cyclical in itself because people who are shut in, they like to sit at home and knit, so they sell more yarn than ever. But the website has become very, very important. If you're a store that doesn't have a website, well, then you're facing a much bigger uphill struggle because you have to establish that. So I think companies that have an online arm of what they do are now able to sort of shift much more of their attention over to that. It goes from being something you did on the side to being the main thing you do. If you're already in there, you have some competence in how to do it, you have some technical and pedagogical and digital ability, then you're in a much better place.
What do you think? What are your thoughts on this? How do you think potentially this virus will affect our inclination to choose training in classrooms versus online training long term also?
I doubt it. I've been working with new technologies for a long time. When a new technology comes along, we always think that it's going to replace everything, right?
Yeah.
And then it turns out, well, no. So there will be a lot of focus on online now. There will be a lot of focus on teleconferencing, video conferencing, like we do now, digital delivery. There will be a permanent uptick in that because a lot of people will find that having short training, you know, tailored to what you're doing, delivered right before you're supposed to do something, that becomes much more the normal. But I'm very confident that we will go back to a substantial part of the market being physical afterwards, because people want the immersive experience of a course. There are a whole lot of things that you just, well, you can't. I'm not going to say you can't teach. There are things you can't teach online, but there are a lot of things that are much easier taught when you're there in person, especially things that require lots of people talking together and communicating.
And then you have, of course, the practical teaching that you can't replace with online, of course. But online training is not something new. It's been around for many years, but many companies haven't really made the digital shift until now, where they really pushed. And we see, the COVID-19 has nudged and pushed many training providers to now really jump into delivering online training, and it's certainly changing a lot of the attitudes towards online training. Is what we're seeing now actually just along the way the change that would have taken place, do you think?
It certainly accelerates the development. Um, there's been, I mean, we've had, I remember doing online teaching in 1985, actually. We didn't even have the internet. We had people dialed in via modems and things like that. No video conferencing, obviously, but it's always been there, but it's been an alternative either for students who couldn't afford the full-time experience, or for students who were in locations that they couldn't travel, for instance. So there's always been remote teaching, but it's been seen as a kind of poor cousin of the real thing, much cheaper. And what I think will happen now is that for a lot of training, it will become an equally powerful way of delivering it. There are certain advantages to online teaching, such as, for instance, you can do it in much smaller portions.
In our third video series, we're going to be talking about, how we can practically, the practical steps of converting training from classroom to online, training delivery. But what we're seeing now, especially in the higher education industry, the concept of, emergency remote teaching is being introduced, driven basically by the infection control policies. And these hurried moves to online training doesn't really necessarily take full advantage of the possibility of the online format. No, is there a chance that the hurried moves to emergency remote teaching may lead to a reversion to older format once the crisis abates, do you think?
Well, I've had quite a bit of discussions with people in top management positions in universities, and I do quite a bit of teaching now, and I always ask the students, how do you think this will continue? And it depends on how long this takes, because it is already, to a large degree, affecting recruiting in universities, particularly in the executive market. And it affects international recruiting quite badly. I think it's also the timing. If this situation persists for a whole semester or even a whole year, it might look like it. Certainly the end of this semester and perhaps most of the fall semester. If it kind of hits every step in the process of a university, or for instance, somebody who does training, recruitment, immatriculation, teaching, assignments, grading, exams, graduation, if you do all of that online for 1 year, well, then you kind of know how to do it, right? and the students, some students will say, well, why do I need to spend all this money to travel to a campus, be there? I can do so much of this online.
So this would also apply for a training provider with short courses, and we'll come back to that in our third video when we talk about the practical steps of actually preparing that. But if you look at some of the the effects and maybe disruptive effects on the pandemic, what would you say are the key success factors of taking full advantage of the affordance of online training?
Well, you need to be very on message. You need to be very focused in what you deliver and very clear learning goals, because you don't have the physical presence of the classroom. You can't impose your personality as a teacher, or you can't impose prestige in the same way as you can if you're an upmarket course provider. You don't have the ambience. The students are sitting by themselves. They're not part of a group. They don't feel like part of the group. And you have to find some way of recreating that. So getting interaction is hard. I mean, anybody can do, look into a camera and talk for an hour with PowerPoints. That's easy. But you know what? There are going to be about 6,000 other teachers out there doing precisely that. So the differentiation is going to be in to what extent you can generate interaction, to what extent you can make the students want to come to you and only you as a course provider, as a university, or even as an individual teacher. And that necessitates making the students aware of each other and generating interaction. And that's hard.
Now that brings me on to a very interesting subject. You basically introduced it now. One of the obvious changes to see now that people are using, the video conferencing tools like Zoom, who the stock price soared by more than 100% since the start of the year, have been beaten up a little bit lately, but still are experiences massive increase in usage. And how do you think both short term and long term this shift to the online training format will affect the competitive climate in the training industry?
Well, you have to differentiate yourself by different means. If you look at, well, let's take the market I know best, which is universities, but the same thing apply for a lot of other course and training providers. The main differentiation is geographical. You have sort of the world stars, the Harvards and the MIT and the Stanfords of the world. But if you go beyond maybe 10, 15 well-known brands, you're looking at hundreds or thousands of course providers that, the quality is very good, what they do, but they don't have any brand value. And the main differentiation is geographical. So you have this university of a certain city, and its main competitive advantage is that it is in that city. Well, if I'm a student living in that city and things are only available online, so am I going to go with the university of my city, or am I going to go to Harvard or MIT? Well, I know what I would choose, and I have been to Harvard, and it's good.
Right. I see. And so basically that you're saying that in this new normal, if this is how we can coin, the effect of the pandemic, in this new normal situation, we'll have a competitive climate where even a local training provider in Oslo,
Mhm.
would be actually competing with big household names,
Yep.
potentially. And so that means you really have to work on differentiation and making sure you stand out from all the global competitors that will knock on your door.
Absolutely. I mean, one way of doing it is take a look at your website, take away any reference to the name of the university or name of the training provider and where it is physically, and then say, do that with you and with some of the competition, and then say, do I look precisely the same as the competition? Well, time to start thinking. What can I do that is different? That does not have to be where I am or all these other things. I mean, the local language will still be a competitive advantage. If you teach, I teach at a big business school in Oslo, and for the Norwegian market, well, we speak Norwegian, right? That's a great competitive advantage because a lot of students want their classes in Norwegian, and there are lots of so that's a competitive advantage. But at certain levels, people get better and better in English. Maybe you're looking at a global market after all.
Right. Well, so if we were to sum up a little bit the threats and opportunities here in for training providers inherent in this shift,
Mhm.
what would be like some of the main bullet points here?
Well, there will be a transition to more online, and some of that transition will be permanent. That means new competition. There will be a reduction in the overall market. would be my hypothesis, for obvious reasons. And in that process, quite a few training providers will go out of business. And those who will go out of business are the ones that are not differentiated. So they're just like everybody else. And the ones that are slow to go online.
That's actually my next question. How should training providers adapt to this new reality, and how quickly now, if they're not doing online training,
Mm.
they're facing this forced shift now because of containment measures.
Mm.
How quickly do they need to move now to position themselves in this new reality of significantly more online training?
Well, they need to get online as soon as possible, and a lot of them are doing it. Again, I can just speak from personal experience, but I have seen at the business school and the university I teach that people are turning around and going online, people who never would do it before. And most of them are doing a pretty decent job. I mean, it's, what I tend to tell people when you're going online is that, when you teach, because I coach teachers, I say, there are two things that are important. A, you have to know your stuff, right? If you don't, well, then it's kind of hard. And secondly, you need to care about the students on the other side. And if you do that, it shows through. And so that's the most important part. And then there's a lot of technology and so on, but that's the short-term thing, getting online and just taking what you do physically and doing it online. But pretty soon you have to start to adapt what you do to the new format. And there are lots of things around that you need to think about. It takes too long to talk about it here. Right. And then you also start to think about things like, what's your business model going to be? Because the costs are different and the pricing will be different. How are you going to market this thing? The marketing is different if you're doing it online. You can't invite people to campus to have the grand tour. Okay, so how do you deal with that? So big challenges. What certainly you have to do is get started.
I mean, short term, don't worry about being perfect. Speed trumps perfection here.
Mm-hmm.
And then that means basically just get the delivery platform up and running and run the training as you would in a classroom. Only just get continuity in your revenue base.
Yeah.
And then start planning to take advantage of the full advantage of the online format by design and business model and pricing and even the teaching and the content of the course. I read one of your blogs, and of course, COVID-19 is first and foremost a horrible tragedy, probably unprecedented throughout history with so many lives lost globally. But there's also a saying that in every adversity, there's a seed of a greater benefit. And I also believe you've discussed in one of your blog posts, we should never waste a good crisis. Mm-hmm. What can we learn from this, Espen?
I have a passion for technology and sort of using technology to do new things and learn from it. We've seen a tremendous acceleration of this. At the business school I teach, we had a year-long discussion about changing the online platform, the video conferencing. Then this happened and we made the decision and got everybody on for 1.5 days. And then you start thinking, do we really need to spend a year having a discussion about what tool to choose? Why not just get it, figure it out? If it doesn't work, you throw it away and you get another one, right? Move to, when you're in a crisis, the decision model is very much try something, make, all decisions are kind of temporary, and you figure things out. Does this work? Does this work? Does this work? Okay, and you go along like that. And the wonderful thing about being in a crisis is that your customers understand what you're doing and they're willing to accept your experiments. When I was, I moved all my classes online on 6 hours notice, and my students were not the quality wasn't wonderful, but the students were happy that we managed to do it at all. So, and we learned as we went along that this works, this doesn't work, and so on. So, having that attitude of trying something out, get a new tool, have an appetite for new technology, that's how you get on top of a crisis. And I think in that respect, it is you have to treat it as an opportunity, as tragic as it is.
Yeah. And I guess to end, this discussion, I guess, we can only speculate because we don't know there's no final blueprint here of what's going to happen after the COVID-19, but certainly there's a couple of things we've seen, and we definitely see that there's going to be more training moving to online formats. Whether the market will go up or down and change in content, that remains to be seen. But I guess one of the things that one of a couple of keywords I have made note of in today's discussion, based on your input here, is we need to adapt and we need to be inventive.
Absolutely. Yep.
Espen, I thank you so much for your time today and your perspective on this.
Thanks for having me.
And you're welcome. And I look forward to the next video where we're going to be talking about the benefits of online formats and doing training both in both the self-paced e-learning format and also the virtual classroom based training. Thank you so much today.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye. In the discussion today, we're going to be talking about the benefits of moving to an online format. Interesting statistics, because we hear, I don't know why that is floating around as a nearly a myth that, it's less effective to do online learning. But I'm sitting here with stats saying that e-learning actually increases retention rates by 25 to 60%.